Last Sunday, Victor Luna preached on the woman with the hemorrhage, and her picture continues to stay on the screen. I'm going to read the full story. We're going to talk about kind of the whole piece of Scripture, but we're primarily going to talk about Jairus and his daughter, which is the beginning of it. Jesus had been hanging out at the Sea of Galilee. Actually, he had been on the far side of the Sea of Galilee in Gennesaret and had healed a man who was full of demons. And it was the one with the swine, and they ran and fell into the lake and were all drowned. And then he gets in a boat and he goes back over to the other side, and the side that he was mostly a part of his ministry, in Capernaum side, and he immediately attracts a crowd. And so I'm going to read chapter 5, verse 21 and following. Jesus crossed again in a boat to the other side, and a great crowd gathered around him. He was by the sea. And one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came up and saw him and fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And so he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. And there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, and she had endured much under physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better. In fact, she had grown worse. She had heard that Jesus had come and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his cloak, I will be made well." And immediately the hemorrhage stopped, and she felt her body was being healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone out from him, Jesus turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched me?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing that what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was speaking this, some people had come from the leader's house and said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to come except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they had come into the house of the leader of the synagogue, they saw the commotion, the people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, they said to him, "Why do you make such a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. And he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went up to where the child was. And he took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk around, and she was 12 years of age. And at this they were overcome with amazement, and he strictly ordered them to tell no one of this. And he also told him to give her something to eat. I'm going to talk a little bit about death and resurrection in different terms than what you've normally heard. Normally, we talk about death at a death and resurrection at a death, a service of memorial or a funeral. We spend our time, as ministers anyway, talking about the relevance of a person's life, the things that they did that made them holy, which is like all things, and the comfort of God's care in them, that they are not just dead and bounded to the abyss, but have found in God's love a resurrection into new life and to new being. It's a hard thing for a lot of people to accept, and it's a hope that a lot of people have, that what happens to the person when they die? Is it the end? We cease to exist? Or is there something beyond that? Is there something in us or innate in God's love that brings us forward into God's very presence and makes our life even more complete than it is here on earth? I happen to believe that we do go forward into God's presence. I will not venture a guess what that's like at all. I mean, people have spent a lot of time on that, streets paved with gold, the shrine of God, a mansion in the sky. There's all kinds of things that go with that people picture of what a reunion with all the people they've known and have gone on before. And all of the things may well be a part of being in God's presence, but I don't know. I'll tell you when I get there. The type of resurrection I want to talk about today is the resurrection of people who are left behind, those who grieve the passing of someone who is very important to them, those who find themselves devastated, lost, looking for reason and understanding. I've seen it over and over. I've lived it in my life. I remember in 2011, I got a phone call at 11 o'clock at night from my sister and said, Tommy has been in an accident and he's at the Mission Valley Hospital. I got in my car and drove down there immediately. And when I had gotten down there, he was dead. In fact, his parents had told the parents, my sister and her husband, they were completely devastated. I asked if I could spend some time with him. And so they let me in a room where I was by myself with him. He was still intubated, had the tubes in him and everything, but he was there. He was a stupid child. He had decided to go out with some friends that night in his four-wheel drive that had roll bars all through it, and neglected to put seatbelts on, and had fallen asleep driving to a place and had rolled the car and ejected everyone out of it. It was stupid of him. Especially he had seatbelts that went 5 different ways. But because he made an error, did it mean that his life was meaningless? Because he had done this thing, he had left his parents devastated, and the rest, as well as the rest of the family. I remember doing the service for him a couple weeks afterward, and it was full of high school students, all of his peers. He was a senior in high school when he died. And all of those people, mostly young, trying to make some semblance out of a tragic death and trying to figure out what does that really mean other than there's extreme grief that they had. Tommy didn't need the resurrection. He was already in God's presence. The people who needed the resurrection were the people who were there at the service, the family who was feeling that great loss, all of us who were grieving deeply that day. I've met them. I've met people who have witnessed deaths in their life, and they're like dead themselves. The grief of that moment, the person being taken away, the things that made their life so meaningful and gave them relevance and reverence is gone with that person's death, and they are awash in loss that finds no end. People who have walked those deep valleys and have never gotten out to the other side. We've had them walk into the sanctuary looking for some help, looking for some kind of relevance, looking for some healing for what they've had. And I would say over time, they've all received some. It doesn't mean that the hurt or the loss goes away in any sense of meaning or at all, but it does mean, being a part of the church, that there is some hope. Some hope is given back to them, some relevance, some meaning for life, some idea that God is caring for them as well as the one that they had lost. The person is being made whole in a congregation. It's really, people have kind of given up on church for a whole bunch of different reasons. One, they don't feel it's relevant. So others think it's boring. Others say that, I have better things to do on Sunday, like me, laundry. There are things that happen, and that people don't avail themselves to it. And I'm kind of sorry for that in this one case, is that there's no other institution in our society that tells people how to be alive. There isn't. You can find your peer group, you can do all kinds of other things, you can do stuff, but it's really, this is the only places of faith are the only place in our society that gives meaning to life. beyond it's just the moment that we live it, that gives meaning to people who have lost things, that they have no sense of how to recover. It gives meaning to people to know that somehow their loved ones are cared for and that they are cared for too. The church is this resurrection vehicle for us Christians that is ongoing and continually evolving and making sense out of life around us in ways that no other institution is doing it. There are other religious institutions that do that in their own way, but the Christian community talks about resurrection in real and concrete terms, not just for the dead, but for the living too. To be a resurrected person doesn't necessarily mean not necessarily, it doesn't mean that you're dead. It means that you're confronting God and you're confronting the losses and you're looking for hope and you're finding it in several different ways. The story today with Jesus is that he doesn't give up. One person in the middle of the story finds hope just by touching him, and it wasn't even an action of Jesus in a conscious sense. But some people are like that. They just need a touch, and they're the ones who are reaching out. And you may not even know that you're the one who's the healing agent, but they've touched you and have found healing in your very presence. Others, it's more active, like Jesus and the 3 disciples entering into the house and gathering the whole family. It was interesting to me is that in this story, Jesus doesn't push out anybody, but invites everyone to follow into this room. And his act is pretty simple, isn't it? He just takes the girl's hand and says, okay, it's time to get up. No prayer, no appeal to God, no nothing. Just a hand up and life comes back. Sometimes in congregational life, that's all it really takes. We really don't go out of our way to offer big prayers and to say, okay, you're going to be healed now. This is how it's going to be with you. It's no more than someone taking a hand of somebody who's dispossessed or in great loss or moving through an abyss of life to find life again because they've grabbed onto something living, something that's caring for them, something that makes a difference in their life, and you are that agent. We, as a resurrection community, are the people who live out for the Jairuses of the world, who are looking for some kind of hope in the death and dying of all around them. And it can be a whole bunch of different ways. It can be death and dying of a community. It can be death and dying of an individual. It can be death and dying of a culture. It can be death and dying because you've been forced out on your own and no one really cares about you. The church, at its best point, stands in that gap and offers what Jesus offers, life. And life that can be transformative and make a difference for the people around it, and it makes a difference for the people who are doing the work themselves. The important thing about the resurrection that we celebrate on Easter isn't so much that Jesus got up from the grave, it's that everybody who encountered him were completely changed. The encounter of Christ made a difference for all those folks. It made a difference for Paul on the road. It made a difference for Peter and the rest of the disciples. It made a difference for Lydia and the other women of the New Testament. It transformed the life that they had had from one type of life to another type of life because someone had reached out into their life and drew them up. And that's really our call even today. Too often, preachers spend too much time talking about saving people from hell, when we really need to save them into life. We need to give them the ability to believe that there's something more to their life than just what they're living in the moment, that there is reason and something to live for and something they can do and make a difference on, and what that really is required of that is nothing more than someone gathering up their life and being a part of someone else's life, showing it all. The ups, the downs, the losses, the triumphs, and saying, this is real life, and I am going to journey with you. This congregation has been around a long time, 140 years plus now. And the reason it's still here is because we have been offering ourselves as a resurrection vehicle to so many people. They have found within this place some sense of faith renewed, some sense of a new mission on life, some way to look at the world in a different way, some healing where they were really dispossessed, some place of acceptance when they felt on the outside, some place to belong. And we belong because Christ, because of the resurrection. And we live that out in each of our worship services. We live that out at the table of Christ before you. And we live it out as we give ourselves over to others. Sometimes we are the resurrection of the dead, even those who are around us today. Amen.